She belongs to me, since last night. In the center of Red Bluff Square, Nathaniel Hayes's voice thundered like a storm, leaving the crowd frozen in silence. Eliza stood rooted, her heart stilled. She had ridden hundreds of miles to escape the shackles of Jacob Rawlins, the man who once whispered sweet words only to turn her life into a prison. In a blinding storm, when her strength had nearly failed, a widowed man had caught her in his arms. And now, before the one who once claimed her, he declared his claim with words that shook the earth. That single sentence was both a shield against the jeers of the crowd and the spark of a storm yet to come. From that moment, Eliza was no longer the runaway, but the center of a battle for honor. And the question remained, was it a vow of true protection, or the beginning of a fiercer storm? The pounding of hooves thundered down the red dirt road, mingling with lightning that split the late summer sky. Rain lashed the earth like a whip, blurring the sun-scorched fields of Wyoming beneath a shroud of water. Through the downpour, Eliza Carter clutched the reins tight, her dress snagging against the saddle, soaked fabric clinging to her trembling frame. On her left wrist, a bruise stood out dark and merciless, a brand she could not conceal. Jacob Rawlins had once come to her with roses and honeyed words, with promises of a sturdy home and a future carved in stone. But every illusion had fallen away like a mask ripped apart. Beneath the polished veneer, he was nothing but a tyrant, quick-tempered, domineering, wielding the betrothal contract like an iron shackle. Eliza had felt the bite of his fury when she dared to resist, his hand tangling in her hair, slamming her down onto the floor, his voice hissing that she was his possession and nothing more. And now, beneath the wrath of the storm, she had but one chance left. Run. In her hand, the marriage contract, unsigned and rain-soaked, blurred until the ink bled like broken faith. She clutched it hard, proof that this union was never sealed, proof that freedom still lay ahead. Each lurch of her horse strained her fragile hope further, mud splattering, wind and rain slashing against her face. The hooves behind her had faded, yet Eliza dared not look back. In her mind, Jacob was always there, a looming shadow waiting to seize her. Every gust of wind carried his voice, every echo of thunder his threat. She dug her heels harder, driving her horse recklessly through the mire, letting her dress tear, letting her shoes drown in water and mud. The dirt road through Whispering Creek was second nature to local cowboys. But to Eliza, a woman desperate and drained, it twisted into a labyrinth of peril. Trees bent beneath the rain, branches hissing as though nature itself sought to bar her way. Her horse labored, breath steaming white in the cold rain. Eliza whispered, more to herself than to the animal, "Just a little farther." But the beast slipped hard in the mud, legs flailing, collapsing beneath her. She tumbled into the sodden grass, the impact jolting pain up her arm. But no bruise hurt as much as the panic clawing at her chest. Staggering, she tried to lift the horse, but it lay heaving, head bowed, strength spent. She dropped to her knees at the roadside, body shuddering, tears and rain mingling down her face. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked tight. The dread of being dragged back, of being forced to sign away her soul, of drowning again in the cycle of violence, it swallowed her like the dark. Then, through the storm, she heard it. A different rhythm of hooves. Steadier. Stronger. A silhouette broke through the white curtain of rain. Tall, cloaked, astride a black horse. As he drew near, a sun-worn face took shape beneath the wide brim of his hat. Nathaniel reined in, looking down at the woman crumpled in the storm. Without questions, without judgment, he dismounted and reached for her. Eliza lifted her eyes, still wild with fear. Yet in that instant, she clung to the solidity of this stranger as if to life itself. He asked nothing, condemned nothing. Instead, he lifted her gently, set her upon his own horse, and spoke in a voice that cut through the storm with quiet certainty. "Don't be afraid. You're safe now." His cabin stood on the hillside, its dark roof trembling beneath the storm. Inside, when he lowered her into a chair by the hearth, water pooled at her feet. Firelight flickered across her pale face and the bruise at her wrist. Nathaniel said nothing, only hung her wet dress near the flames and placed a heavy, worn blanket around her shoulders. Eliza sat there, clutching the blanket, shivering, but slowly feeling its warmth seep in. On the table by the window lay the soaked contract, the words nothing more than smears. She stared at it for a long while. At last, she closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, let herself drift into sleep, one without the shadow of the man who had broken her. Outside, Red Bluff remained unaware of the woman who had arrived with the storm. By morning, whispers would spread from porch to porch. But tonight, there was only a fire burning small against the storm, a quiet man watching, and a broken woman who had found her first refuge on the road of escape. Dawn rose over Whispering Creek beneath a pale mist draped across the hillside. Beads of last night's storm clung to the leaves, glittering beneath the young sunlight, as though the valley itself had been washed clean. Inside the timber cabin, Eliza Carter stirred awake. Her body ached. Her hair was a tangle of damp knots. Her shoes lay drying by the hearth, stiff with the chill of the night. Beyond the walls, the steady rhythm of hammer against wood rang out, sharp, unyielding, reminding her that reality had not ceased to exist. She sat up to find the heavy blanket folded neatly at her side. The air carried the lingering scent of pine smoke. Last night, she had collapsed at the doorstep of this man's cabin, Nathaniel Hayes. Now he stood outside, swinging the axe with practiced ease, each blow clean and deliberate, neither wasted nor wanting. Broad-backed, tall, bearing a weathered silence that clung to him as tightly as his damp shirt. Nathaniel Hayes. She had heard the name before, whispered here and there in Red Bluff. A carpenter of fine skill, yet a man who kept to himself. A widower, long bereaved, absent from church gatherings, seldom seen at town socials. To the community, Nathaniel was the quiet figure on the hill, known only by the sound of his saw and the thin curl of smoke rising from his chimney each evening. Eliza clutched at the half-dry folds of her dress, a pang of unease twisting inside her. She had escaped Jacob Rawlins, the man who bound promises into chains, and now she found herself within the home of a stranger. Was this shelter truly safe? When Nathaniel stepped inside, boots damp with dew marking the floor, he laid the bundle of wood by the hearth and stirred the fire higher. Only when the flames flared did he finally speak, his voice rough, as though seldom used. "You should rest longer. There's some porridge on the stove." Eliza inclined her head, voice barely more than breath. "Thank you for saving me." Nathaniel did not answer at once. He did not pry into where she came from, nor why she had fallen in the storm, nor weigh her with suspicion. His silence itself was startling. For the first time in months, she was seen not as property, but as a person. Her gaze fell to the bruise on her wrist. Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward it, then just as quickly shifted away. He slid a wooden bowl toward her instead. "Eat a little." Simple words, yet warmer than any false pity she had endured. Eliza lifted the spoon, sipping in careful mouthfuls. The porridge was plain, thin, but within it lingered something different. Kindness without cost. Each swallow pressed down the remnants of her fear from the night before. The morning stretched slowly. Eliza hung clothes to dry, stitched the torn curtain over the window, small tasks that softened the cabin's loneliness. Nathaniel said little, yet now and then his glance carried a gentleness even he seemed unaware of. But peace was short-lived. At the well, as she drew water, a neighbor woman passed by, pausing long enough to stare. Her gaze raked Eliza head to toe before she pursed her lips and walked on. Eliza knew what would follow. By morning, the town would hum with whispers, and so it did. Before the sun reached its peak, Red Bluff was already alive with gossip. A colored woman sleeping in Hayes's cabin. The words spread like barbed arrows through the saloon, the marketplace, even the church steps. Voices added their own venom. Well, well, the widower Hayes finally let a woman past his door. What sort of woman throws herself on a man that way? No vows, no ring, shameless. Venomous tongues twisted truth before the people involved could speak a word. Unaware of the full storm brewing below, Eliza felt only the stairs when she stepped into town for a spool of thread. Eyes followed her, curious, judgmental, half cruel. She lowered her head, lips pressed tight. Better endure the whispers than return to Jacob Rawlins, where only violence waited. From his hillside, Nathaniel heard fragments carried on the wind. Years of silence had taught him. Rumors always found their way, and only time would strip them bare. He went on splitting wood, unshaken. That evening, Eliza sat by the fire, mending the frayed hem of her dress. The flames cast her face in weary light, but her hands were steady. Nathaniel set another lot upon the fire, his voice low, almost lost in the crackle. Don't let the voices out there trouble you. Eliza lifted her eyes, glistening, but no words came. In that moment she understood. This widower, cloaked in silence, had given her more than shelter. He had given her protection, without demanding it be named. Outside, the town might tear her apart with their tongues. But inside the cabin, with the storm still dripping from the eaves and the fire holding back the dark, Eliza Carter found something she had not known in years. A fragile beginning. Her own. And from that fragile beginning, the days to come would never again be the same. The days at Whispering Creek passed slowly, as though the storm on the night of Eliza's escape had left behind a hush in which she might begin to heal. The bruises on her wrists faded little by little, and within the plain wooden cabin, she started to carve out a new rhythm of life. Eliza patched the old curtain, sewing scraps of cloth into its worn edges so the wind would not slip through the cracks. Outside, she turned the soil to plant what meager seeds she had found in a wooden box. A glass jar sat on the table, with a handful of wildflowers gathered from the creek's edge. The cabin, once stark and cold, now bore a touch of warmth. Nathaniel said little, only watched in silence, though his gaze lingered longer when he stepped through the doorway, as if quietly acknowledging the change. Each evening, after their simple meal, Eliza would open the tattered books stacked in a corner and read aloud. Her voice filled the small room, sometimes with verses of scripture, sometimes with lines from an old tale. Nathaniel sat still by the fire, hands resting on his knees, his weathered face softening in the glow. He seldom spoke, but his listening was enough for Eliza to know she was no longer invisible. Yet peace remained fragile. Each time Eliza went to the well, she felt eyes on her. Women drawing their children away, young boys tossing jeers her way. She swallowed the hurt, carried her bucket back up the hill, and never uttered a word. Perhaps Nathaniel noticed, for one evening, when he saw the red marks on her palms from the heavy handle, He handed her a coarse cloth and said only, "Wipe it off. Cold water bites deep." Not words of poetry, but truer than any promises she had ever heard. At night, as the cabin creaked beneath the wind, Eliza lay awake listening to the insects across the fields, her heartbeat for the first time steady in the quiet. Nathaniel's steady presence, though silent, was enough to give her something rare, a sense of safety. That safety was fragile as the flowers in the jar. But to Eliza, even a little peace was a miracle after the chains she had endured. The whispers about Eliza did not take long to sweep through Red Bluff. At the saloon, men leaned close, muttering behind half-empty glasses. At the marketplace, strangers' eyes followed her every step. A widower living under the same roof with a strange woman, and no vows spoken. The words fell on Eliza like small stones, never enough to break her, but heavy enough to weigh down her heart each time she returned from the well. She offered no defense. Silence became her only means of survival. Better to endure the gossip than to return to the man who once dragged her to the floor by her hair. One afternoon, while Nathaniel split wood on the porch, Eliza busied herself tidying the old room. Drawers groaned as she pulled them open, dust rising thick in the air. One drawer stuck fast, and it took both hands and all her strength to pry it loose. Beneath a stack of faded cloth, she found a yellowed envelope, unsealed. The paper trembled in her grasp. The handwriting, slanted, graceful, was not a man's hand. Slowly, she read, "If I do not survive this fever, I beg you to let your heart open once more. Do not lock yourself away in silence. Do not let this cabin become a tomb of memories. You have loved me fully, and because of that, I know you can love again. Clara." Eliza stood frozen, her fingers lingering on the final line. Clara, the wife Nathaniel had lost. A letter never sent, or perhaps never meant to be. A warmth spread through Eliza's chest. For so long she had seen herself as nothing more than a lodger, a shadow, someone unwanted. But these words, they felt like a whisper from the woman who came before her. Open your heart. Let love find its way back. Carefully, she folded the letter and placed it exactly where it had been, afraid to disturb the trust it carried. Yet in her own heart, a seed had already been planted. Perhaps her presence here was not chance. Perhaps fate had drawn two broken hearts beneath the same roof. That evening, when Nathaniel returned, wood dust clinging to his shoulders, Eliza quietly added a few more wildflowers to the jar on the table, not to brighten the room, but as a reply to the letter she had just read. Nathaniel paused, his gaze lingering on the flowers, unreadable before he gave a small nod, as if he understood, though he said nothing. Outside, the town still buzzed with rumors, but within the cabin, Eliza felt a steadiness grow inside her. For the first time, she was no longer only a runaway. She began to believe she could be someone chosen, at the right place in the right time. The market day in Red Bluff was one of the rare times the town came alive with noise and bustle. That morning, the main street was jammed with wagons piled high with vegetables, animal hides, and sacks of cornmeal tied with fraying rope. Voices of merchants rose and fell, children darted between stalls, and a traveling fiddler played for spare coins. Eliza walked beside Nathaniel, arms wrapped around an empty basket ready to be filled with salt and scraps of cloth. The late autumn sun slanted gold across moss-covered eaves, warm but brittle with dryness. The smell of baked bread and wood smoke mingled in the air, pulling at the memory of her childhood, days when her hometown market had once felt safe. Now, every step into Red Bluff was its own trial. The townsfolk did not hide their scrutiny. Whispers trailed after her like pricking needles. She's still living at Hayes's place. A colored woman sharing a roof with a man. No vows spoken. Shameful. Eliza clenched her teeth, steadying her breath. Beside her, Nathaniel carried the basket with calloused hands, his silence like a steady wall at her side. He said nothing, yet his sure stride gave Eliza the strength to lift her head higher. They stopped at Mrs. Jenkins's stall to buy salt. Eliza bent to inspect the sturdier cloth bags when the sound of hooves thundered down the street. A group of 4 riders stormed into the square, dust flying, drawing every eye. Leading them was Jacob Rollins. Eliza's heart tightened. He sat tall on his horse, cloak dusty from the road, his face still carrying that false charm she knew too well. Beside him rode a stocky man clutching a leather case, clearly a lawyer. The other 2 were strangers, hired hands by the look of them. Jacob halted in the center of the marketplace, his voice cutting over the noise. "Eliza Carter," he called, making every head turn. "She's lost her senses. She carries my child, and she has run away." Silence fell heavy. His words struck like iron, stirring shock and suspicion into the crowd. Faces turned toward Eliza, wives clutching children tighter, husbands raising brows, children gawking without grasping the meaning, but sensing the weight. Eliza froze, breath caught in her throat, her knees trembling beneath her. The square spun around her as Jacob dismounted, striding forward with deliberate steps. His hand gestured to her belly as though it were proof undeniable. "She has betrayed her betrothal. She carries my blood. I have witnesses, I have papers. I only want to bring her home, to care for her as a husband and father should." Murmurs erupted like wildfire. Few cared whether the documents were real. His bold words alone were enough to feed the crowd's hunger. Women who already doubted her leaned together, whispering with eyes full of both pity and disdain. Eliza's gaze darted across the sea of faces, every eye pressing down on her. Shame rose like a tide, choking her. Memories surged of Jacob's darkened house, his voice a whip, his hands striking. Terror nearly dragged her to her knees. But then, from deep within, something broke free. She drew a long breath, and though her voice shook, it rang clear through the square. "You never laid a hand on me." The market stilled. Each word cut through Jacob's mask like a blade. His jaw twitched, but he forced a mocking laugh. "Her word?" he sneered to the crowd. "A runaway, unhinged, daring to deny what everyone can see." Before the crowd could sway further, Nathaniel stepped forward. He planted himself at Eliza's side, tall and unyielding, his shadow cutting Jacob from her sight. His voice rolled deep and calm, yet carried like thunder. "She belongs to me, since last night." The sound crashed through the square like a storm. Gasps, whispers, muffled laughter, and startled frowns rippled across the crowd. Some men nodded slowly, half in surprise, half in thought. Eliza's world blurred. Her heart pounded so loud she could hardly tell it from the murmurs around her. Jacob faltered, just for a moment, before narrowing his eyes, his mouth curling into a venomous grin. "So that's it," he drawled. "A lonely widower and a ragged runaway, clinging to each other in the dark. A comedy for the ages." But the laughter he expected never came. His words hung in the air, brittle, falling flat. A few glances in the crowd wavered, no longer certain which truth to believe. Eliza's fingers clenched the handle of her basket, breath ragged. She dared not look at Nathaniel, dared not believe what he had declared before so many. Yet that single sentence forced Jacob back, made him stumble one step. The square grew heavy with tension. Dust, sweat, and horseflesh thickened the air. Eliza's heart hammered, half in fear, half in something she could not name. For the first time, someone had claimed her, not as property, but as protection. The square still buzzed with shock, but Eliza heard only one thing, echoing like an oath in her chest. Nathaniel's voice, deep and steady as an oak. She belongs to me since last night. Night fell over Whispering Creek with an uncanny stillness. Autumn winds swept through the pines, their whispering needles brushing the roof with a hushed rattle. Inside the small cabin, the fire in the hearth had dwindled to faint flickers, casting restless shadows over two figures seated in silence. Eliza sat at the corner of the table, her hands clasped tight, fingers twisted pale. The marketplace still haunted her. The whispers, the stares that burned like open flame. But more than anything, it was Nathaniel's words, hurled into the square like thunder, that cut deepest. She belongs to me, since last night. Confusion gnawed at her until she could no longer keep her calm. She lifted her gaze, eyes glistening in the firelight, and spoke, her voice trembling yet firm. "Why did you say that, Nathaniel? Why before the whole town did you declare such a thing?" The room was still, save for the crackle of wood. Nathaniel sat across from her, tall and weighted with silence. At last he raised his head, his eyes deep as the night itself, and answered with a voice rough yet steady. "Because it is what I truly desire." The simplicity of it stilled her heart. Eliza opened her mouth to speak, but faltered. The truth in his eyes shattered every question she had held back. Nathaniel did not speak again. He rose, boots tapping softly on the worn floorboards, and came to stand before her. Slowly, he bent, lifting her chin with a warm, calloused hand. His gaze did not falter, gentle but resolute. Then, with quiet certainty, he leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was not hurried, not hidden, not a shield against gossip. It was a confession, simple, unadorned, yet carrying the weight of all that had gone unsaid. Eliza trembled. In that moment, she heard her heartbeat entwined with the steady breath of the man before her. His lips, roughened by years of silence, brushed hers, washed with both strangeness and safety, startling yet promising. When he drew back, she remained motionless, her hand rising instinctively to her lips. Her eyes wavered, fear, confusion, and warmth battling within. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. But he only set his hand lightly on her shoulder, unpressing. "You need not answer, Eliza. I only wanted you to know what I truly long for." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a wolf's cry echoing from the distant hills. The town beyond lay steeped in darkness, still buzzing with talk and judgment. But within the cabin, another fire had quietly sparked. Eliza rose and crossed to the window. The patched curtain stirred in the draft, revealing a sky awash with stars. The valley shimmered silver beneath the moon, Whispering Creek glinting like a trail of light. All was hushed, but within her raged a storm. Part of her longed to believe in the safety Nathaniel offered, in the truth of his words. Yet shadows lingered. Jacob's fists, his lies, his chains. They clung like darkness, warning her not to trust too soon. She turned back. Nathaniel still stood where he was, silent, steady, his eyes waiting without demand. And it was that very patience that gripped her heart. "You don't know what I've endured," Eliza said softly, her voice raw. I have heard too many promises. I've been broken for believing in sweet words. I don't know if I have the courage to trust again." Nathaniel stepped forward, stopping just near enough not to frighten her. His nod was slow, deliberate. "I know, and I don't need you to trust me now. I only need you to know that if the day ever comes when you choose to, I'll be here." His words fell light as ash, yet carried the weight of iron. Eliza studied him for a long while, then gave the faintest nod. No answer, no vow, only eyes rimmed with tears, holding both fear and the first fragile trace of hope. That night stretched longer than any before. Eliza lay upon the narrow bed behind the burlap curtain, listening to Nathaniel's slow steps in the other room, the creak of his chair by the fire. Smoke and pine filled the air. In her drifting half-sleep, she still felt the warmth of his kiss, and his words echoed softly. "Because it is what I truly desire." She did not know what the town would say come morning, what lies Jacob would spin, or how sharp the gazes would grow. But here, in the night, she knew she had crossed a threshold, a place of truth, of fear, and of a tender hope just beginning to take root. Beyond the hills, the wind kept moving. Inside the cabin, two broken hearts had begun to find each other, slowly, tentatively, yet unmistakably. Autumn came late to Whispering Creek most years, but that season the winds shifted early. Yellow leaves scattered along the dirt roads into Red Bluff, and the air in town was heavy, clinging like tobacco smoke that lingered too long in the saloon. After the fateful market day, rumors of Eliza Carter spread faster than prairie fire on dry grass. No longer whispered behind her back, the stares came openly now. Wives pulled their children aside as she passed. Young men lounging on the saloon steps smirked, puffing smoke into the air before tossing out their jibes. Careful now, before Hayes's cabin turns into a brothel. Eliza learned to grit her teeth and walk on, eyes lowered, arms clutching her basket of vegetables or scraps of cloth. Yet no matter how she tried, every hissed word found its mark, carving fresh cuts into a pride already scarred. One evening, while Nathaniel tended the fire on the porch, a folded slip of paper was shoved beneath the door. Eliza picked it up, the ink smeared, the words jagged. "A woman like you will drag this whole town into the mud." Her hands shook, the note slipping to the floor. Before she could stoop, Nathaniel entered, his eyes flicking once over the words. Without comment, he tossed it into the flames, letting fire devour what was worthless. But for Eliza, the knife of those words had already lodged deep. That night, she lay restless on the narrow bed behind the burlap curtain. Her fear no longer came from Jacob, but from the community itself, a place where a single accusation could condemn her without proof. Would there come a day when Nathaniel regretted the words he'd spoken in the square? Regret taking her beneath his roof? The next morning, as she scrubbed clothes by the creek, a figure appeared through the mist. Mrs. Holbrook, the innkeeper, sharp-tongued and sharp-eyed, known for missing nothing. She set a basket of fresh bread on the grass, butter scent rising warm into the chill. "Take it, girl," she said firmly, leaving no room for refusal. Eliza shook her head. "I shouldn't. People already say too much about me. If you help me, they'll—" Mrs. Holbrook cut her short, eyes flashing but softening for just a moment. "Let them. They fear what they don't understand. But I see a woman strong enough to lift her head while the town tries to press it down." Eliza gripped the wet fabric in her hands, throat tightening. For the first time since arriving in Red Bluff, someone besides Nathaniel had stood for her. without whispers, without pity, only recognition. The older woman sat beside her on the bank, voice low and steady. Folk throw stones when they see someone different. You're a colored woman, living in a widower's cabin. That shakes the walls of their little boxes. And fear turns into gossip. Eliza nodded faintly, eyes brimming. I've lived with their scorn all my life, but it still cuts, because I never wanted to be a burden. Listen, Mrs. Holbrook pressed her rough hand gently over Eliza's. This town whispered about me too, said I was greedy for keeping a boarding house, but time proved otherwise. The work I do is straighter than their tongues. You'll find the same. Don't let them shrink you down. Her words seeped into Eliza like warmth into morning frost. She bowed her head. Thank you, I'll remember. That day, Eliza walked back to the cabin with lighter steps. Nathaniel looked up from sawing wood when he saw the basket of bread in her arms. He raised a brow but said nothing. Eliza offered no explanation, only set the basket on the table, a small flame stirring in her chest. But the undercurrents did not fade. At night in the saloon, Jacob's name still dripped poison into eager ears. Children were told to keep away from the hill cabin. Even neighbors who once greeted Nathaniel now turned their eyes aside. Eliza knew she remained surrounded. Yet for the first time, she was not utterly alone. Mrs. Holbrook's blunt kindness had dropped anchor in her heart, keeping her steady against the storm. That night, before blowing out the lamp, Eliza lingered at the window, staring at the scattered lanterns below the valley. Each one could be a house filled with whispers, or a house capable of change. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering words that startled even herself. Maybe I'm beginning to belong here. Outside, autumn winds swept through Whispering Creek, carrying both chill and the murmur of change. Inside the cabin, Eliza sat by the fire, and for the first time felt the flame she guarded was not only to warm her past, but to light her days to come. That afternoon, the sky over Whispering Creek grew heavy, gray clouds piling against the ridge as though warning of a storm yet to break. Eliza knelt in the garden rows, hands still stained with soil, when the pounding of hooves thundered from the distance. The sound drained the blood from her veins. Her breath shortened, steps faltered, and before she could rise, a figure filled the open ground before the cabin. Jacob Rawlins. He swung down from his horse, boots striking the damp earth, his face flushed red with rage. Without greeting, he stormed forward, his rough hand seizing Eliza's wrist in a crushing grip. "Enough, Eliza!" he snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey and cigar smoke. "This charade has gone on long enough. You're coming home, now." Eliza stumbled back, struggling to wrench free, but her strength was no match for a man bred to reins and whips. The old bruise burned like fire, memories of past violence flashing back until her knees threatened to give way. "Let me go, Jacob," she cried, her voice breaking into sobs. "You have no right." "No right?" He cut her off, teeth clenched. "I am your betrothed. The whole town knows it. Running away only makes you look mad. I'll drag you back, screaming if I must." His grip tightened, yanking her toward the tethered horse. At that instant, heavy footsteps thudded along the dirt path. Nathaniel Hayes had returned. The axe still hung across his shoulder, his shirt streaked with sweat and sawdust. But the moment his eyes fell on the scene, Eliza's pale face twisted in pain, her wrist crushed in Jacob's grip. Every trace of weariness vanished. In a single motion, Nathaniel cast aside the axe and drew the revolver at his hip. The sharp click of the hammer rang like steel splitting stone. "Let her go." His voice was not loud, but it rolled like boulders falling from a cliff. Jacob froze, startled, then sneered instead of loosening his grip. "And who the hell are you to aim a gun at me? She is my fiancée, and I'll take her back where she belongs." "She doesn't belong to you," Nathaniel said, eyes cold as a blade, revolver steady in his hand. "Release her, now!" The silence was suffocating, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines. Eliza's chest heaved, her hand trembling in Jacob's hold, but Nathaniel's presence steadied the chaos of her heart. Jacob glared between them for a long, searing moment. Then, with a curse, he shoved Eliza back as though discarding a broken object. "Fine," he spat, eyes blazing. "Keep her, but don't think this is the end." He vaulted onto his horse, jerking the reins so hard the animal screamed and reared before bolting down the slope. In his haste, he never noticed the leather-bound ledger that slipped from his coat, landing in the mud. Eliza clutched her aching wrist while Nathaniel stood rooted, revolver raised until the rider vanished into the hills. Only then did he lower the gun, exhaling heavy. He stooped and picked up the fallen book, its cover stained with dirt. "His," Nathaniel muttered, brushing off the mud before handing it to Eliza. Her fingers trembled as she opened the first pages. The smell of damp ink and leather rose up. Scrawled lines filled with numbers, ledgers, and banking codes. She flipped faster, eyes widening. Page after page revealed false loans, fraudulent transfers, debts concealed under false names. And then, in bold script, the words struck like a bullet. St. Louis Bank, unauthorized transfer, $4,000, signed J.R. Eliza froze, clutching the edge of the book, her heart hammering. "Dear God," she whispered, "he's not just a brute. He's a swindler." Nathaniel settled onto the porch step, taking the book back to scan its pages. His face darkened, jaw set as he read further, then snapped it shut. "If this is true," he said low, "Jacob Rawlins is more than a threat to you. He's breaking the law, cheating the bank, the city, everyone." Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her breath. The image of Jacob, smug in the market square with lies spilling from his lips, now twisted into something far more dangerous. He had treated her like property, but this ledger proved he treated justice itself as a game. Nathaniel tucked the ledger into a wooden chest. "We'll take this to the authorities," he said firmly. "His reckoning won't come from rumor. It will come from the law." Eliza nodded, though her voice trembled. "Do you think they'll believe me?" "They don't need to believe you," Nathaniel answered, eyes unwavering. "The numbers will speak. Numbers don't lie." Outside, the wind rose into sharp gusts, battering the door, howling through the cracks like the herald of a storm. But inside the cabin, Eliza felt something shift. Not only fear, hope. For the first time, she held in her hands a weapon that could turn the tide. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "Maybe I don't have to run forever. Maybe this time, it's he who should fear." The news of Jacob Rawlins' arrest for bank fraud spread like wildfire across the dry prairie. The leather-bound ledger Eliza had discovered became undeniable proof, forcing him to bow before the law. Yet even as justice closed its grip on Jacob, the weight of Red Bluff's judgment still bore down. In the saloon, whispers lingered. In the marketplace, eyes cut sharp. The town might believe Jacob a swindler, but belief in a black woman from nowhere was another matter entirely. Some scoffed openly. Sure, he cheated, but a woman like her is nothing but trouble. Eliza heard it more than once. She held her silence, knowing sometimes quiet resolve spoke louder than 1,000 defenses. Then came the autumn fair. Red Bluff donned a new face, Banners of color strung along the main street, stalls piled high with golden corn, red apples, pumpkin pies sending sweet warmth into the air. The fiddle's music tumbled through the square, mingling with the laughter of children. Folks gathered eager for a day of merriment, a chance to forget the grind of the year. Eliza walked in with Mrs. Holbrook at her side. Her dress was plain. Her basket carried a few spools of thread she hoped to sell. The moment she stepped onto the square, eyes turned, some cold, some uncertain, some edged with pity. She had grown used to such looks, yet within the joyous noise of the fair, she felt like an exile pressed against an invisible wall. Mrs. Holbrook leaned close, her voice sharp as ever. "Hold your head high, Eliza. Don't let them tell you who you are." Eliza nodded faintly, a thin smile trembling on her lips, though weariness gnawed inside. The music, the cheers, the scent of baked bread, all shattered in a heartbeat at a scream. "Look out! The boy!" Chaos rippled. A wagon loaded with grain barreled down the sloping road into the square, wheels skidding, the driver yanking the reins in vain. The front wheel jolted from its track, the wagon careening wildly, and in its path, a boy no older than 6 lay sprawled, eyes wide with terror. The crowd froze. Cries rang out, but no one moved fast enough. Eliza did not think. Instinct took her. She flung her basket aside, skirts whipping against the dirt as she sprinted. In a blur, she seized the reins, digging her heels into the ground. The force nearly wrenched her from her feet, her knees scraping raw, but she held on. The horses shrieked, thrashing. Eliza's hands burned, skin splitting on the coarse rope, but she clung with every ounce of strength. The wagon thundered so close, the wheel tore at the hem of the boy's shirt, yet slowed just enough for a man nearby to dive forward and snatch him clear. The wagon lurched another few yards before shuddering to a halt in a cloud of dust. Silence fell over the square. Eliza dropped to the ground, skirt torn, breath ragged, hands bleeding, still clutching the reins. Beside her, the boy burst into sobs and flung himself into his mother's arms as she rushed in. Woman fell to her knees before Eliza, tears streaming. "God sent you to save my child." The words tore through the invisible wall that had hemmed her in for months. Around them, the crowd stirred. Shocked whispers rose, then the first hesitant claps, spreading, swelling, until the square echoed with applause. Eliza lifted her head. For the first time, she met their eyes and found not only suspicion, not only disdain, but respect, even reverence. Voices murmured, "She saved him. Without her, the boy would be gone." An old man shook his head, muttering, "Maybe we were wrong." Eliza bowed slightly, tears hot against the dirt and sweat on her cheeks. Her raw, trembling hands still stung, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. By nightfall, the fair quieted. Music drifted faint from the distance, but Eliza sat on Mrs. Holbrook's porch steps, lost in the echo of applause, in the shifting eyes of a town that had begun to see her differently. Nathaniel came then, broad frame outlined in the lamplight. He said little, only sat beside her, eyes resting on her torn hands. At last, he exhaled softly. "You don't need to prove anything more. They've seen who you are." Eliza smiled, weary yet radiant as a new moon. Tears slid silently, no longer born of pain, but of peace. For the first time, she knew she was no longer entirely alone. That winter came earlier than most. By October, the hills around Whispering Creek wore white coats, snow blanketing the trail into town. Wind hissed through the old pines, carrying a chill that cut straight to the bone. For many, winter was a season of hardship, but for Eliza Carter, it marked a turning point in her life. After the upheaval at the autumn fair, the eyes of the townsfolk began to change. Where once there had been only suspicion and scorn, now there were nods of greeting, small words of courtesy when she passed along the street. Not everyone was warm, but the outright contempt had faded. Eliza felt the invisible wall between herself and Red Bluff begin to crack. At Nathaniel Hayes's cabin, the change was clearer still. He built a small room against the side of the house, roof sturdy, furniture neatly made. Eliza turned it into a schoolroom. Rough planks became blackboards. A few old books loaned by Mrs. Holbrook lined the shelf. Each morning, children gathered at the door, eager voices filling the air as Eliza patiently guided their hands through letters and sums. At first their parents had been reluctant, but when they saw their children return home, sounding out words, writing their own names on scraps of paper, they smiled, relief softening their brows. In time, the small school became a quiet pride of Whispering Creek. None could deny it was Eliza who had given it to them. Each evening, when snow piled deep on the porch, Eliza sat by the lamplight, copying lessons for the next day. Nathaniel, silent as always, carved new benches and tables, his rough hands unexpectedly deft when shaping what the children needed. Sometimes, when Eliza lifted her head, she found his gaze resting on her. Steady, calm, as warm as the fire at his side. By December, the town gathered for the winter service at the church. It was the season of Thanksgiving, of offering gratitude to God for carrying them through another year. The small wooden chapel glowed with candlelight, hymns rising through frosted windows. Families trudged through the snow in heavy coats, scarves wrapped tight, boots crunching ice beneath their steps. Eliza entered with Nathaniel. For a moment, the air shifted, silence pulling taut. Eyes turned toward them. Once that moment would have crushed her. But now her hand was held firmly in Nathaniel's. He did not hide, did not hesitate. His hand clasped hers openly, as if to tell the world, Eliza was no longer alone. The service flowed with song and sermon. At its close, the pastor invited the congregation to offer words of thanks. Farmers spoke of harvests spared, herders of cattle surviving blizzards, families of health restored. Then, to everyone's surprise, Nathaniel Hayes, the man known for his silence, rose to his feet. He stood tall, his frame bent slightly with years, candlelight tracing the lines of his weathered face. His gaze swept the room, pausing at each familiar countenance, and his voice rang out, deep and sure. "There is something I must say before the whole town." Whispers rippled. Few had ever heard Nathaniel address a crowd. He tightened his grip on Eliza's hand, motioning her forward. She faltered, heart pounding, but his eyes gave her courage. Together they stood beneath the candle's glow. Nathaniel's voice carried, strong as a hammer striking wood. "She does not belong only to me. She belongs to Whispering Creek. This place she has chosen as home." The chapel fell silent. His words echoed, breaking down walls long raised. Faces turned, some startled, some softened. A few heads bowed, and here and there smiles flickered into being. Eliza's vision blurred. The simple strength of his declaration warmed her like fire against the frozen night. For months she had borne whispers and prejudice, but now, before them all, Nathaniel had lifted her into the place she had thought forever denied her, a part of the community. The murmurs spread. A mother nodded, her eyes tender on Eliza. An old man leaned on his cane, mumbling, "Aye, this is her home too." Eliza stood still, her hand in Nathaniel's, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks. Not of pain, but of freedom. She no longer needed daring acts to prove herself, no longer had to fight every word of doubt. One sentence, spoken openly, was enough to claim her place. When the service ended, hands reached for Nathaniel, and heads dipped in greeting to Eliza. Not all, but enough to show the change was real. Mrs. Holbrook came forward, pulling Eliza into a brief, firm embrace. In the stern woman's eyes, Eliza read pride. That night, as snow thickened against the windows, Eliza stood in the doorway of the small schoolroom, gazing at the faint lights of town in the valley. For the first time, she knew she was truly seen. More than that, she had found a place to call home. After the winter service, Whispering Creek slowly settled into quiet once more. Yet an unseen change had already taken root. The cruel whispers that once clung to Eliza Carter like barbed wire had dissolved. No longer did eyes cut her down when she passed. Instead, folks spoke in hushed tones of the woman who had thrown herself before a runaway wagon to save a child, of the teacher who opened a school in the cabin on the hill. At the next market, as Eliza passed the vegetable stalls, old Mrs. McBride, once the sharpest tongue in town, hesitated. She held out a bundle of carrots, stammering, "These came up fine this season. Take some, for the children." Eliza blinked, then smiled as she accepted without reproach. In that simple moment, an unseen cord loosened. Day by day, her place deepened in the town's rhythm. Each morning, small footsteps pattered up the hill, arms clutching slates and pencils, voices bubbling with laughter. The cramped, rough-hewn room filled with the sound of beginnings. Letters once shaky grew steady across the wooden board. Children read aloud their first sentences, their eyes alight with pride. Parents no longer spoke of her as that colored woman from nowhere. Now she was Teacher Eliza, patiently guiding their children. By spring, a young father built another bench for the classroom, while Mrs. Holbrook donated fresh books fetched from Cheyenne. Eliza had become part of Whispering Creek's lifeblood. On the hill, Nathaniel Hayes watched these changes with his quiet steadfastness. Each afternoon, as children's laughter trailed down the path, he sat on the porch, carving scraps of wood into little horses or toy boats. The children treasured them as if they were gold. Nathaniel spoke little, but Eliza knew he was the proudest of them all. One evening, as Eliza gathered her chalkboard, Nathaniel brought a new wooden frame. Inside it lay a sheet of paper bearing clumsy letters. Whispering Creek School, the place where freedom begins. Her fingers trembled as she touched the frame, eyes stinging. She understood then. What she had given was not only letters and numbers, but proof that even those once rejected and despised could become a light for others. That summer, during the town's founding celebration, tables lined the square with pies and stew, fiddles singing into the air. The pastor rose, naming each family's labor, each person's gift. Then he paused, turning toward Eliza. "Some come to us from elsewhere, strangers at first, yet become indispensable. Eliza Carter reminds us this town is not just land, but an open home." Applause rose. Eliza's heart jolted, her eyes wet. But when she saw Nathaniel in the crowd, his quiet smile steady upon her, strength flowed into her bones. For the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she lifted her head without fear. That night, back at the cabin, summer winds stirred the shutters. Eliza sat at the window, watching lanterns flicker in the town valley. Inside her, a new rhythm pulsed, not the frantic beat of flight, but the calm breath of belonging. She remembered the storm, Jacob's crushing grip, the poison of his lies. Once she believed her life would forever be chained by fear. Yet here she stood, with a town that had opened its arms, and a man unashamed to hold her hand before them all. Eliza smiled, a smile light as the breeze, deep as roots. In her eyes glimmered not fear, but freedom. People often say a person's legacy is not in wealth, but in the mark left on others' hearts. For Whispering Creek, Eliza Carter's legacy was a small schoolhouse where children spelled out their dreams. It was the memory of a woman who risked her life to save a child. It was the story of an outcast once spurned, now bound into the town's very fabric. And most of all, it was Eliza walking beside Nathaniel. Two souls who had known loss and shadow, yet found in each other the light reborn. On that hill, the humble cabin had changed its meaning. No longer only the shelter of a widower, it had become the home of a love restored. Winters would still blanket the earth, summers blaze golden, but Eliza now knew she had roots. Years after that winter service, the hill at Whispering Creek was no longer a lonely place. The wooden cabin, once the dwelling of a widower steeped in silence and a woman scorned as an outcast, had become a home brimming with laughter. Folks in the valley called it the House of Light, for from that cabin came the first lessons of the town's school, and from that cabin grew a family bound by love, labor, and faith. Eliza and Nathaniel had 3 children. The firstborn was Clara May Hayes, named for Nathaniel's late wife. She came into the world on a spring morning as the snow melted into streams that trickled down the hillside. When the midwife placed the child in Eliza's arms, Nathaniel sat silent for a long while, his eyes damp yet steady. "It is how we keep a memory without turning it into chains," he said, and Eliza nodded. Clara grew with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, a child bright with restless curiosity. She was never without a book, always asking questions, sounding out words by lamplight. The townsfolk whispered she was the child born of change, proof that the bond between Eliza and Nathaniel had been accepted at last. The second, Ezekiel Hayes, was born on a storm-torn night. Thunder rolled across the valley, lightning splitting the sky, and in the cabin his first cry rose louder than the wind. Nathaniel held his son, calloused hands trembling. "Strong as the storm itself," he murmured. And true enough, Ezekiel grew bold and fearless, the first to leap bareback on a horse or dive into the freezing creek. His temper was wild, but his heart was kind. Often he lingered in his mother's class to help younger children learn their letters. It was Ezekiel who first dreamed aloud of a real schoolhouse rising in Whispering Creek, grander than the narrow room on the hill. The youngest, Ruth Hayes, was the gentleness of them all. She was born in summer, when the meadows burned with wildflowers. Ruth's smile softened every heart in town. She would sit for hours beside her father, watching him carve toys from scraps of wood. Patient, tender, quiet. She bore the same quiet depth Eliza once carried when she first arrived. As she grew, Ruth took joy in helping with her mother's lessons, showing smaller children how to trace their letters. Folks said, "If Clara is the mind and Ezekiel the strength, then Ruth is the heart of Whispering Creek." In those years, the cabin was never without children's voices. At dawn, Clara led her siblings to the stream. Ruth gathered flowers. Ezekiel chased the foals through the pasture. In the afternoons, when Eliza's class dismissed, the town's children lingered to play with the Hayes brood. Once, Ezekiel scrambled onto the cabin roof and declared he would one day build the largest stone school in all Wyoming. The children laughed, but Eliza, watching from the porch, felt it was no childish boast. rather the seed of a future. Soon, the town grew, accustomed to seeing the Hayes children racing through Red Bluff. No one spoke of Eliza's origins anymore. They saw only a devoted mother, a steadfast father, and 3 young lives bringing new hope to the community. Winter evenings, when the blizzards howled, children crowded into the classroom, clustered around Eliza as Nathaniel stoked the fire. Clara read poems aloud, Ezekiel scrawled chalk drawings on the board. Ruth hummed softly by the hearth. Those simple sounds became the heartbeat of Whispering Creek. Years later, as the settlement expanded, townsfolk proposed building a proper schoolhouse near the square. When they debated what to name it, the pastor stood and said, "It must be Whispering Creek School, for that is where it began, on the hill, with Eliza Carter." At the dedication, Clara was 16, standing proud beside her mother, reading the first lesson on the new blackboard. Ezekiel, 14, hauled benches and laughed as if it were his own barn raising. Ruth, just 10, clutched Nathaniel's hand and whispered, "Father, I want to teach like Mother." The people looked at the 3 children and knew the legacy was not only a schoolhouse but a generation sprung from love and courage. When Eliza's hair had silvered, she often sat at the window gazing down the path into town. Her children were grown then. Clara had become the school's first teacher, carrying forward her mother's dream. Ezekiel had ridden off to join the cavalry, but each time he returned, he filled the square with tales of faraway lands. Ruth, quiet as the wind, stayed behind, tending her parents and keeping the cabin hearth alive. The townsfolk told their children, "Those Hayes children were born of the hill, where Eliza Carter and Nathaniel Hayes once lived, once loved, and built their home." In that telling, their story became not merely a memory, but a living ballad of Whispering Creek. Once, at the anniversary of the town's founding, Clara, by then headmistress of the school, stood before the gathered crowd. Her voice, clear and strong, carried over the square. "My mother taught me that legacy is not in wealth, but in how we touch the hearts of others. If today you can write your name, read a verse of scripture, or believe your children may go further still, it is because of the hill where my mother began." The crowd fell silent. Then the square erupted in applause. Nathaniel, white-haired, clasped Eliza's hand. She turned to him, eyes blurred with tears, her smile shining still. In that moment she knew. Every mile of flight, every lash of fear, every cruel whisper had led to this hill, this family, this town that now bore their story as its own. And so Whispering Creek carried a legacy not of soil alone, but of love strong enough to outlast scorn. The cabin on the hill became a symbol. Folks spoke of it not with pity, but with pride. Seasons rolled on, winters blanketing white, summers blazing gold, and children's footsteps marked the path deeper into the earth, writing new stories into the land. Eliza Carter, once a runaway in the storm, left not only memory, but blood and breath carried on in her children. Clara, Ezekiel, Ruth, the living proof that when love is planted in freedom, it grows and spreads. People say a person's legacy is not measured in possessions, but in the mark left on others. For Whispering Creek, Eliza's legacy was a small school where children spelled out their dreams. It was the tale of a woman who leapt before a wagon to save a child. It was the story of an outcast, once driven away, who became the heart of a town. And above all, it was the sight of Eliza walking beside Nathaniel. 2 souls who had known grief and shadow, yet found in each other a light reborn. On that hill, the cabin of rough pine took on a different meaning, no longer just the shelter of a widower. It became the home of a love renewed. Winters would still fall, summers would still blaze, But Eliza knew at last. She had roots. The story does not end in thunderous music, but in quiet reverberation. From a woman fleeing through rain, Eliza Carter had become the emblem of Whispering Creek, of resilience, of compassion, and above all, of freedom restored. And when her children carried the name Hayes into the years ahead, the hill bore witness still, its legacy not written in stone but in the lives it shaped. This story does not close with clamor, but with quiet reverberation. From a woman fleeing in the storm, Eliza Carter had become the emblem of Whispering Creek, of resilience, of compassion, and above all, of freedom regained. Looking back on the tale of Eliza and Nathaniel, we see not only a woman breaking free of darkness, but the power of trust and love within a small community. From cruel gossip to the moment when the town applauded as one, she proved that dignity and freedom cannot be buried. Nathaniel, through patience and steadfast heart, became her harbor. And Whispering Creek, once closed, had at last thrown wide its doors. Perhaps for many of us, their story recalls fragments of our own, of late-found love, of losses unnamed, yet also of the hope that happiness can be found in any season of life. If this story has touched you, we invite you to leave a comment, share your reflections, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so together we may continue walking through these Wild West journeys of love, faith, and renewal.